My name is Jerry Kowalski, and I'm a dairy farmer from Wisconsin who survived the first 30 days when the world froze over. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged Earth into an ice age, I had to keep 300 cattle alive, protect a family of strangers, and make the hardest decision of my life. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Jerry Kowalski, and I'm a dairy farmer from Wisconsin who survived the first 30 days when the world froze over. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged Earth into an ice age, I had to keep 300 cattle alive, protect a family of strangers, and make the hardest decision of my life. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I've been running this dairy operation for 14 years now, ever since my father died in a farming accident. 3 generations of Kowalski men have worked this land, and I always figured I'd pass it down to my kids someday. That was before my wife Sarah got sick 3 years ago. Cancer took her fast, and my 2 kids moved to the cities after that. Can't say I blame them. Farming isn't easy money, and watching your mother die in a hospital bed doesn't exactly make you want to stick around the place that reminds you of her every day. So it was just me and my 300 Holstein cattle on 800 acres of Wisconsin farmland. Every morning at 4 o'clock, I'd roll out of bed, check the weather on my phone, and head to the barn for milking. The routine never changed. Check the automated milking system, make sure the feed dispensers were working, inspect the cattle for any signs of illness or injury. By 6 in the morning, I'd have the morning chores done and be sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, listening to the agricultural report on the radio. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the Dust Bowl back in the 30s, how the sky turned black with dirt and crops died in the fields, how families packed up everything they owned and headed west, looking for work and a chance to start over. He stayed, though. Granddad was stubborn like that. He'd rather die on his own land than live somewhere else. Dad was the same way, and I guess I inherited that trait too. This farm was everything to me, especially after Sarah died. It was the only thing I had left that connected me to my family. August 15th started like any other day, except something felt wrong from the moment I stepped outside. The thermometer on my porch read 45 degrees, which was 30 degrees colder than normal for mid-August in Wisconsin. The air had a strange quality to it, almost electric, like the feeling you get right before a massive thunderstorm. My cattle were acting strange too. Instead of spreading out across the pasture like they usually did, they were huddled together near the barn, making low, anxious sounds I'd never heard before. I turned on the radio while I was milking, half expecting to hear about some weather front moving through. Instead, the emergency broadcast system came on with that piercing tone that makes your skin crawl. The announcer's voice was shaky, professional but barely controlled. Yellowstone National Park had experienced what they called a supervolcanic eruption. The entire caldera had blown, sending ash and debris 30 miles into the atmosphere. They were calling it the largest volcanic event in recorded human history. At first, I didn't think much of it. Yellowstone was way out in Wyoming, more than 1,000 miles from my farm. Sure, it sounded bad for the folks out there, but Wisconsin had seen its share of natural disasters. Tornadoes, blizzards, floods. We always managed to get through them. I figured this would be like those times when Mount St. Helens erupted back in 1980. Some ash might fall, the sunsets might be pretty for a while, but life would go on. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. The cattle stayed huddled together all day, even when I put out fresh hay in the far pasture. Normally, they'd spread out to graze, but something was keeping them close to the barn. Animals have instincts that we humans have forgotten. They can sense changes in air pressure, electromagnetic fields, things we can't perceive. My grandfather always said to watch the animals when you're not sure what weather's coming. If the cows are nervous, you should be too. By evening, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. I brought the cattle into the barn earlier than usual, something I normally wouldn't do until October. The radio was full of reports about the ash cloud spreading eastward, but the meteorologists were saying it would thin out by the time it reached the Midwest. They were talking about maybe a few degrees of temperature drop, nothing that would cause serious problems. I spent that evening checking my equipment. The backup generator in the barn, the diesel fuel tanks, the emergency supplies Sarah had insisted we keep in the basement. She was always worried about power outages during ice storms, so we had enough canned food and water to last a month. At the time, I thought it was overkill. Sarah always prepared for the worst-case scenario, while I figured we'd muddle through whatever came our way. That night, I called my neighbor Jim Peterson, who runs a smaller operation about 2 miles down the road. Jim's family had been farming there almost as long as mine, and he'd seen everything Wisconsin weather could throw at us. His voice sounded concerned when he answered the phone, which was unusual for Jim. He was normally the most laid-back guy you'd ever meet. Jim told me his cattle were acting the same way mine were. Nervous, staying close to shelter, not eating as much as usual. He'd also noticed that the birds had gone quiet. No robins singing, no crows calling from the fence posts. Even the insects seemed to have disappeared. Jim said it reminded him of the calm before a really bad storm, except there were no storm clouds on the horizon. We agreed to check on each other daily, something we'd never felt the need to do before. Jim had a ham radio set up in his barn, and he promised to keep me updated on any news from the outside world. Neither of us had cell phone service that worked reliably out here, and the landline connections were getting spotty. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to check the thermometer. By midnight, it had dropped to 35 degrees. By 3 in the morning, it was down to 30. I'd never seen temperatures like that in August, not even during the coldest years I could remember. The second day brought the ash. I woke up at 4 o'clock like always, but when I looked out the window, it was snowing. Except it wasn't snow. It was gray, fine particles falling from the sky like powder. The ash was so fine it looked like fog. But when I touched it, it felt gritty between my fingers. Everything outside was covered in a thin layer of gray dust. I'd dealt with plenty of Wisconsin winters, so I knew how to protect my operation from precipitation. I covered the hay bales with tarps, made sure the cattle had access to clean water, and sealed up any openings in the barn where the ash might get in. The cattle were even more agitated than the day before. They were making sounds I'd never heard, almost like they were trying to warn me about something. The radio reports were getting more serious. The ash cloud was spreading faster than anyone had predicted, and temperatures were dropping across the entire northern United States. Power grids were starting to fail as the ash interfered with electrical systems. The governors of several states were declaring states of emergency and asking people to stay indoors. I tried calling my kids that morning, but the phone lines were jammed. My daughter lived in Minneapolis, and my son was in Milwaukee. Both cities were probably getting hit harder than my rural area. I kept telling myself they were smart kids, that they'd figure out how to stay safe until this whole thing blew over. But deep down, I was starting to worry that this wasn't going to blow over anytime soon. The ash kept falling for 3 straight days. By the end of the 3rd day, there was 2 inches of it covering everything. The temperature had dropped to 25 degrees, colder than most Wisconsin winters. I'd never seen anything like it. The sky was this constant gray color, like being inside a cloud that never moved. I spent those days making sure my cattle were as comfortable as possible. I moved them all into the main barn and set up extra heaters using my diesel generator. The automatic milking system was still working, but I had to clean the ash out of the water troughs every few hours. The cattle weren't producing as much milk as usual, which was a sign they were stressed. My neighbor Jim stopped by on the fourth day, driving his old pickup truck slowly through the ash-covered roads. He looked worried, more worried than I'd ever seen him. Jim told me that his wife had been listening to the ham radio, picking up signals from all over the country. Cities were losing power, highways were closing, and the government was telling people to prepare for extended cold weather. Jim's cattle were in worse shape than mine. He didn't have as good a barn setup, and he'd lost 3 head already. They'd just laid down in the field and died, probably from the cold and the ash they'd breathed in. Jim asked if I had any extra hay, and I gave him what I could spare. Even then, I was starting to worry about my own feed supplies. That evening, I sat in my kitchen and did the math. With the cattle eating more to stay warm, my hay supply would last maybe 6 weeks instead of the usual 3 months. My diesel fuel for the generator would last about a month if I ran it continuously. The canned food Sarah had stockpiled would keep me fed for 3 weeks, maybe 4 if I was careful. I found myself talking to Sarah's picture on the kitchen table, something I'd started doing after she died. I'd tell her about my day, ask her what she thought I should do about problems on the farm. That night I asked her what she'd do if she were here. I could almost hear her voice telling me to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. The 5th day brought the worst cold yet. The thermometer read 15 degrees when I woke up, colder than most January mornings. The ash had stopped falling, but the sky was still that unnatural gray color. It was like the sun had been erased from existence. I'd never experienced anything like it in my entire life. I spent the morning checking on my cattle and noticed that some of them were showing signs of respiratory problems from breathing the ash. I gave them what antibiotics I had, but I wasn't a veterinarian. I was just a farmer trying to keep his animals alive in conditions nobody had ever prepared for. The radio reports were getting scarier. Major cities were losing power as the ash clogged air filters in power plants. Transportation systems were shutting down because the ash was too thick for planes to fly and too slippery for vehicles to drive safely. The government was talking about emergency shelters and evacuation procedures, but they couldn't seem to agree on where people should go or how they'd get there. I tried the phone again that morning, but there was no dial tone. The landlines were down, probably because of the ash interfering with the equipment. I was completely cut off from the outside world except for the radio, and even that was starting to get staticky. By the 6th day, I was really starting to worry. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees, and my cattle were burning through feed faster than ever. I'd already lost 2 head, both older cows that couldn't handle the stress of the cold. I buried them in the back pasture, saying a prayer for them like my grandfather used to do. That afternoon, I walked through the barn, checking on each animal individually. These cattle weren't just livestock to me. I'd raised most of them from calves, knew their personalities, their health problems, their habits. Losing them felt like losing family members. I found myself thinking about my grandfather's stories again. How he'd survived the Dust Bowl by being stubborn and resourceful. How he'd made do with less and found ways to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. Granddad always said that farmers are survivors by nature. We deal with droughts, floods, diseases, market crashes. We learn to adapt or we don't survive. But this was different. This wasn't a normal disaster that would pass in a few days or weeks. The ash in the atmosphere was blocking the sun, and without sunlight, the temperatures weren't going to go back to normal anytime soon. I was starting to realize that this might be the new normal, at least for a while. One spent the evening organizing my supplies and making lists of what I had and how long it would last. The basement was full of Sarah's canned vegetables, preserved meat, and dried goods. She'd always been the practical one, the one who planned ahead. I was grateful for her foresight, even though I'd teased her about it when she was alive. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a kerosene lantern, conserving generator fuel. The silence outside was complete. No insects, no birds, no wind. It was like the whole world had died. I kept thinking about my kids, wondering if they were safe, if they'd found shelter, if they even knew what was happening to the world. I made a decision that night. I was going to stay on this farm, no matter what. 3 generations of Kowalski men had worked this land, and I wasn't going to be the one to abandon it. I had enough supplies to last for weeks, maybe months if I was careful. I had the skills to repair equipment, to keep animals alive, to grow food when the weather got better. But as I sat there in the flickering light, listening to the absolute silence outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much worse was coming. The ash was just the beginning. The real test of survival was still ahead of us. The radio crackled to life one more time before I went to bed. The announcer's voice was tired, defeated. He was reading a bulletin from the National Weather Service about extended cold temperatures and possible infrastructure failures. Then the signal faded to static, and I was alone with my thoughts and the sound of my cattle shifting restlessly in their stalls. I didn't know it then, but that was the last normal night I'd have for a very long time. The next morning would bring visitors, and with them, the realization that I wasn't going to survive this alone. But that's a story for tomorrow, when the real test of survival began. The 7th day changed everything. I woke up at 4 o'clock like always, but when I reached for the light switch, nothing happened. The power was completely dead. No hum from the refrigerator, no automatic systems in the barn, no heat pumps keeping the house warm. Just silence and the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. I fumbled around in the dark until I found my flashlight, then made my way to the basement to check the main electrical panel. Every breaker was fine, which meant the problem was with the grid itself. The ash had finally done what everyone was afraid it would do. It had brought down the power system across the entire region. My backup generator was in the barn, a diesel-powered unit that Sarah had insisted we buy after a particularly bad ice storm 5 years ago. At the time, I thought it was overkill. We'd never had a power outage that lasted more than a few hours. But Sarah always planned for the worst-case scenario, and right then, I was grateful for her paranoia. The generator fired up on the second try, filling the barn with the steady rumble of the diesel engine. I'd calculated that I had about 300 gallons of diesel fuel stored in the tank behind the barn. If I was careful, if I only ran the generator for essential systems, it might last me a month, maybe 6 weeks if I was really disciplined about it. The cattle were in bad shape. Without the automatic heating system, the barn temperature had dropped to just above freezing. Several of the older cows were showing signs of hypothermia, standing with their heads down and their bodies shivering. I connected the generator to the barn's heating system and watched the temperature gauge slowly climb back to a survivable level. I spent the morning doing inventory of everything I had. The basement was still full of Sarah's preserved food, enough to keep one person fed for about a month. The hayloft had enough feed for my cattle for maybe 3 weeks if they kept eating at their current rate. The diesel fuel would last a month if I was careful. The propane tank for the kitchen stove was half full. By noon, the outside temperature had dropped to 5 degrees. 5 degrees in the middle of August. I'd never seen anything like it, not even in the worst Wisconsin winters. I found myself checking the thermometer every hour, hoping it would start climbing back up, but it just kept getting colder. The radio was my only connection to the outside world, and the news wasn't good. Cities across the Midwest were experiencing total power failures. Transportation systems had collapsed because the ash made roads too slippery for vehicles and too dangerous for aircraft. The government was setting up emergency shelters, but they were already overcrowded and running out of supplies. I tried to reach my kids again, but the phone lines were still dead. Minneapolis and Milwaukee were both mentioned in the emergency broadcasts as cities under severe distress. I kept telling myself that they were smart, that they'd find a way to stay safe, but I couldn't shake the worry that was eating at me. That afternoon, I walked through the barn checking on each cow individually. These animals had been my life for 14 years. I knew their names, their personalities, their health problems. Seeing them struggle with the cold was like watching family members suffer. I did everything I could to keep them comfortable. But I was fighting a losing battle against temperatures that shouldn't exist. I found 3 dead cows in the back stalls. They just laid down and died during the night, probably from the combination of cold and the respiratory problems caused by breathing ash. I dragged their bodies outside and buried them in the back pasture, saying a prayer for each one like my grandfather had taught me. It was hard, physical work in the freezing air, but it felt important to treat them with dignity. The 8th day brought even colder temperatures. The thermometer read 0 degrees when I woke up, colder than most January nights. The diesel generator was running constantly now, and I could hear it burning through fuel that I couldn't replace. Every hour it ran was an hour closer to the time when I'd have to choose between keeping the cattle warm and keeping myself alive. I spent the morning working on the heating system, trying to make it more efficient. I'd learned basic mechanical skills from my father, and I'd picked up more over the years from necessity. When you're running a farm, you learn to fix things yourself because calling a repair service isn't always an option. Those skills were keeping me alive now. The radio brought news of complete infrastructure collapse in major cities. Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Detroit. All of them were reporting massive power outages, transportation failures, and emergency services that were overwhelmed. The government was talking about federal disaster relief, but it was clear that help wasn't coming anytime soon. I found myself talking to Sarah's picture more often. I'd tell her about the problems I was facing, ask her what she thought I should do. Sometimes I could almost hear her voice, practical and calm, telling me to take things one step at a time. She'd always been the level-headed one in our relationship, the one who could see solutions when I was too overwhelmed to think straight. That evening, I walked out to the edge of my property and looked around at the landscape. Everything was covered in gray ash, and the sky was that same unnatural color it had been for days. No stars, no moon, just a uniform gray that made it impossible to tell whether it was day or night without checking the clock. The silence was complete. No insects, no birds, no sounds of life anywhere. I realized that I might be one of the few people left in the area who was still alive and functioning. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead it made me more determined. 3 generations of Kowalski men had worked this land, and I wasn't going to be the one to give up. The 9th day brought the first real test of my survival skills. The generator started making a grinding noise that I'd never heard before, the kind of sound that means expensive parts are about to fail. I shut it down immediately and spent the next 4 hours taking it apart to find the problem. The fuel filter was clogged with ash particles that had somehow gotten into the diesel tank. I cleaned it as best I could, but I knew it was only a temporary fix. The ash was so fine that it was getting into everything, contaminating fuel, clogging air filters, interfering with any system that needed to breathe. I had spare filters in the barn, but they wouldn't last forever. While the generator was down, the barn temperature dropped to 15 degrees. I could hear the cattle making distressed sounds, the kind of low moaning that means they're in pain. I got the generator running again as quickly as I could, but I'd lost 2 more cows during those 4 hours. The cold was killing them faster than I could save them. I spent the afternoon calculating how long my supplies would last. The math was simple and terrifying. At the current rate of consumption, I had maybe 2 weeks of diesel fuel left. The hay would last about the same amount of time. The canned food would keep me alive for 3 weeks if I was careful. After that, I'd be facing starvation and freezing to death. The radio brought news of refugee camps being set up in the southern states, places where the ashfall hadn't been as heavy and temperatures were still survivable. But getting there would mean abandoning my farm, leaving my cattle to die, and traveling through hundreds of miles of frozen, ash-covered roads with no guarantee that I'd make it alive. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a kerosene lantern, trying to figure out what to do. I could hear Sarah's voice in my head, practical and calm, telling me to think through all my options. She'd always been good at seeing the big picture. When I was too focused on immediate problems, I made a list of everything I had and everything I needed. Food, fuel, shelter, tools, weapons. The list of what I had was getting shorter every day. The list of what I needed was getting longer. I was fighting a losing battle, and I knew it. The 10th day brought visitors. I was in the barn checking on the cattle when I heard the sound of an engine struggling through the ash-covered roads. I grabbed my hunting rifle and went to the window, not sure what to expect. In a situation like this, strangers could be desperate. People looking for supplies to steal. What I saw was a small sedan stuck in the ash drift at the end of my driveway. The car was loaded down with suitcases and boxes, and I could see people moving around inside. They'd been trying to drive south, probably heading for one of those refugee camps I'd heard about on the radio. I watched them for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to help them, but I also knew that my supplies were limited. Every mouth I fed was food taken away from my own survival. Every person I sheltered was someone who'd be competing with me for warmth and resources. But I couldn't just watch them freeze to death in their car. I put on my winter coat and walked out to meet them, keeping the rifle visible but not threatening. The driver was a man about my age, thin and nervous looking. The passenger was a woman with a young girl, maybe 8 years old, in the back seat. The man introduced himself as Mark, and he told me they were trying to get to his sister's house in Tennessee. They'd been driving for 2 days, sleeping in the car, living on gas station snacks and whatever they could find. Their car had gotten stuck in the ash, and they didn't have the tools or the knowledge to get it free. The woman was Lisa, Mark's wife, and the little girl was their daughter Emma. They looked exhausted, scared, and cold. Emma was wearing a thin jacket that wouldn't have been adequate for a normal Wisconsin winter, let alone the conditions we were facing. I helped them push their car out of the ash drift, but it was clear that the vehicle wasn't going to make it much further. The ash had gotten into the engine, and it was running rough. The tires were nearly bald, and they didn't have chains or any other equipment for driving in these conditions. Mark asked if I knew of any shelter nearby, any place where they could wait out the cold weather. I could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear of a father who didn't know how to protect his family. I'd never had children of my own, but I could imagine what he was going through. I made a decision that would change everything. I invited them to stay in my house until the weather got better. I told myself it was temporary, just until they could figure out their next move. But deep down, I knew I was making the commitment that would stretch my resources to the breaking point. I helped them carry their belongings into the house and showed them to the spare bedroom. They were grateful, almost embarrassingly so. Mark kept thanking me and asking what he could do to help. Lisa was quiet, but I could see the relief in her eyes. Emma was just a kid, scared and confused by everything that was happening. That evening, I sat them down and explained the situation. I told them about my limited supplies, about the generator that was keeping us alive, about the cattle that were dying in the barn. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't a hotel, that we were all in survival mode. Mark had been an accountant in Milwaukee before everything collapsed. He didn't know anything about farming, about generators, about surviving in extreme conditions. Lisa had been a teacher. They were city people, used to having electricity and heat and food available at the flip of a switch or the turn of a key. I spent the next few hours teaching them the basics of survival. How to conserve fuel, how to ration food, how to dress for extreme cold. They were quick learners, and they were motivated by the need to protect their daughter. Emma was a smart kid, and she understood more about the situation than her parents probably realized. The 11th day brought new challenges. With 4 people in the house instead of 1, my fuel consumption doubled. The generator was running harder, trying to heat more space and power more systems. I calculated that my diesel fuel would last maybe 10 days instead of the 3 weeks I'd been counting on. I also had to deal with the reality of feeding 3 extra people. The canned food that would have lasted me a month would barely last a week with 4 mouths to feed. I started rationing immediately, giving everyone smaller portions and stretching meals with whatever I could find. Mark tried to help with the cattle, but he didn't have the experience or the physical strength for farm work. He was willing, but he was also a liability. Every mistake he made was a mistake I had to fix, and I didn't have time or energy to waste on training someone who might not be around long enough to make it worthwhile. Lisa was more useful. She had organizational skills, and she took over the job of managing our food supplies and keeping track of fuel consumption. She also helped with Emma, keeping the girl occupied and calm during the long cold hours when there wasn't much else to do. The 12th day brought the coldest temperatures yet. The thermometer read -5 degrees when I woke up, colder than the worst Wisconsin winter I could remember. The generator was running constantly now, and I could hear it struggling under the load. I knew it was only a matter of time before something failed. I spent the morning in the barn, checking on the cattle that were still alive. I'd lost 12 head in the past week, and the survivors were in poor condition. They were burning through feed faster than ever, trying to generate enough body heat to stay alive. I was facing the reality that I might have to start slaughtering healthy animals just to have enough feed for the others. The radio brought news of complete societal collapse in most northern cities. The government was losing control of the situation, and military units were being deployed to maintain order in refugee camps. There were reports of violence, of people fighting over food and shelter, of families being separated in the chaos. I found myself thinking about my grandfather again, about the stories he'd told me about the Dust Bowl. He'd survived by being stubborn and resourceful, by refusing to give up when everything seemed hopeless. But he'd also survived because he'd been alone, because he'd only had himself to worry about. I was responsible for 3 other people now, and that changed everything. That afternoon, I sat down with Mark and Lisa to talk about the future. I told them honestly that my supplies wouldn't last much longer, that we needed to start thinking about what we'd do when the fuel ran out or the food was gone. They listened quietly, and I could see the fear in their eyes. Mark suggested that we try to reach the refugee camps in the south, but I knew that was a fantasy. The roads were impassable, and even if we could get through, there was no guarantee that the camps would have room for us or supplies to keep us alive. We'd be trading one desperate situation for another. Lisa asked if there was any chance that the government would send help, that rescue teams would make it to rural areas like ours. I didn't have the heart to tell her that we were probably on our own, that no one was coming to save us, that we were too far from anywhere important to matter to the people making decisions. That night, I lay in bed listening to the generator running outside and thinking about the impossible choices I was facing. I could try to save everyone and probably fail, or I could make hard decisions about who deserved to survive and who didn't. Neither option felt right, but I was running out of time to find a better solution. The 13th day brought mechanical failure. The generator started making a grinding noise that I recognized as bearing failure. I shut it down immediately and spent the next 6 hours trying to repair it with the limited tools and parts I had available. The barn temperature dropped to 10 degrees while I worked, and I could hear the cattle making distressed sounds. I managed to get the generator running again, but I knew it was a temporary fix. The bearings were wearing out, and I didn't have the parts to replace them properly. Every hour it ran was bringing it closer to complete failure, and when that happened, we'd all freeze to death. Mark tried to help with the repairs, but he didn't have the mechanical knowledge or the tools to be useful. He was frustrated by his inability to contribute, and I could see the stress wearing on him. He was used to being the provider for his family, and now he was completely dependent on a stranger who might not be able to save them. Lisa was holding up better, but I could see the strain in her eyes. She was trying to stay strong for Emma, but she was also dealing with the reality that they might not survive this. She asked me quietly if I thought we'd make it through the winter, and I didn't know how to answer her. Emma was the most resilient of all of us. Kids have a way of adapting to situations that would break adults. She helped with simple tasks, stayed out of the way when we were working, and didn't complain about the cold or the limited food. She reminded me of my own daughter at that age, before life got complicated and she moved away. The 14th day brought the realization that I was going to have to make some hard choices. My cattle were dying faster than I could save them, and the survivors were eating through my hay supply at an unsustainable rate. I had maybe a week of feed left, and after that, I'd be watching them starve to death. I spent the morning in the barn, looking at each animal individually and trying to decide which ones had the best chance of survival. It was an impossible decision, like choosing which of your children deserved to live. These cattle weren't just livestock to me. They were individuals with personalities and histories, animals I'd raised from calves and cared for through sickness and health. I made the hardest decision of my farming career. I selected the 20 healthiest, youngest animals and moved them to the warmest part of the barn. The rest would have to be slaughtered for meat, their feed given to the survivors. It was a cruel calculation, but it was the only way to save any of them. Mark helped me with the slaughter, though I could see it was difficult for him. He'd probably never killed anything bigger than a spider, and here he was helping me butcher cattle to keep his family alive. But he did it without complaint, because he understood that this was what survival looked like. We worked through the afternoon, processing the meat and hanging it in the unheated part of the barn where it would stay frozen. It was backbreaking work, but we now had enough protein to last for weeks. The remaining 20 cattle would have enough feed to survive for maybe a month if we were careful. Lisa took over the job of preserving the meat, using Sarah's canning supplies and the knowledge she'd picked up from her grandmother. She worked methodically, turning fresh beef into canned goods that would last for months. It was skilled work, and I was grateful for her expertise. That evening, we sat around the kitchen table eating fresh beef for the first time in days. It should have been a celebration, but it felt more like a funeral. Each bite represented one of my animals, one of the creatures I'd spent years caring for. I thought about my grandfather, about the difficult choices he'd had to make during the Dust Bowl, and I understood him better than I ever had before. The 15th day brought news that changed everything. I was monitoring the radio when I picked up a weak signal from a group of survivors about 200 miles south. They were broadcasting from what sounded like a well-organized camp with generators, food supplies, and medical care. They were asking for anyone in the area to respond, to let them know they weren't alone. I tried to respond, but my radio wasn't powerful enough to reach them. The signal faded in and out, and I couldn't tell if they were receiving my transmission. But knowing that other people were out there, that they'd found a way to survive and even thrive, gave me hope for the first time in days. Mark was excited about the possibility of joining the other survivors, but I wasn't sure it was realistic. 200 miles through ash-covered roads in sub-zero temperatures was a dangerous journey under the best circumstances. With a child and limited supplies, it might be suicide. But staying here wasn't much better. My fuel was running low, My food supplies were limited, and the generator was failing. We had maybe 2 weeks left before we'd be facing starvation and freezing temperatures with no way to keep warm. The other survivors might be our only chance. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at Sarah's picture and trying to decide what to do. I could hear her voice in my head, practical and calm, telling me to think through all the options. She'd always been good at seeing the big picture when I was too focused on immediate problems. I thought about my grandfather, about the stories he'd told me about people who'd stayed during the Dust Bowl and people who'd left. Some had survived by being stubborn and resourceful. Others had died because they'd waited too long to make hard decisions. I was running out of time to choose which group I wanted to belong to. The decision I made that night would determine whether we lived or died, whether we'd find safety with the other survivors or freeze to death trying to reach them. But first, I had to get through the next few days, had to keep the generator running long enough to give us a chance. The real test was just beginning. The 16th morning brought the sound I'd been dreading. The generator coughed, sputtered, and died with a mechanical wheeze that told me the bearings had finally given out completely. I was in the kitchen when it happened, and the sudden silence was more terrifying than any noise I'd ever heard. Steady rumble from outside, no hum of the heating system, no power flowing to keep us alive. I ran to the barn and tried everything I could think of. Checked the fuel lines, cleaned the air filter, adjusted the throttle. Nothing worked. The engine would turn over but wouldn't catch, and when I pulled the housing off, I could see metal shavings in the oil that confirmed my worst fears. The generator was dead, and I didn't have the parts or the tools to bring it back to life. Mark came running when he heard me cursing in the barn. He took one look at my face and knew we were in serious trouble. The barn temperature was already dropping, and we could hear the cattle making distressed sounds as the heating system shut down. We had maybe 6 hours before the cold became life-threatening for both the animals and us. I sent Mark back to the house to tell Lisa what was happening while I started working on emergency measures. I had a smaller backup generator in the workshop, an old gasoline-powered unit that my father had used for emergency repairs. It wasn't big enough to run the whole heating system, but it might keep one room warm enough to survive in. The backup generator started on the 3rd pull, filling the workshop with the familiar sound of a small engine working hard. I ran extension cords to the house and set up a space heater in the living room, creating one warm zone where we could all stay together. It wasn't much, but it was better than freezing to death. Lisa had Emma bundled up in every piece of warm clothing they owned, and the little girl looked like a walking pile of blankets. She was scared, but trying to be brave, the way kids do when they sense that the adults around them are barely holding things together. I admired her courage more than I could say. We moved mattresses into the living room and set up a survival camp around the space heater. I explained to everyone that we had to stay in this one room, that opening doors or windows would let the heat escape and kill us all. The house was already getting cold, and I could see our breath when we talked. The small generator was burning through gasoline much faster than the diesel unit had used fuel. I calculated that we had maybe 3 days of gas left, 4, if we ran it only during the coldest parts of the day. After that, we'd be completely dependent on body heat and blankets to stay alive. I spent the afternoon working frantically to repair the main generator. I pulled parts from other equipment, tried jury-rigging solutions with whatever materials I had available. Mark helped as much as he could, holding tools and following my instructions, but we both knew it was probably hopeless. The cattle were suffering in the unheated barn. I could hear them moving around restlessly, their breathing getting labored as the temperature dropped. I'd already lost so many animals that seeing the survivors in distress was almost unbearable. These were the 20 healthiest cows I'd selected to save, and now I was watching them slowly freeze to death. I made another hard decision that afternoon. I opened the barn doors and drove the cattle out into the barnyard, then opened the gate to let them wander toward the house. If they were going to die anyway, at least they could die trying to find warmth instead of trapped in a freezing building. Lisa asked me what would happen to the cows, and I told her honestly that most of them probably wouldn't survive the night. The cold was too extreme, and they didn't have enough body fat to generate heat in these conditions. But a few of the strongest might make it, and that was better than watching them all die slowly in the barn. Emma wanted to know if we could bring some of the smaller animals into the house with us. I explained that cows were too big and that we needed to keep our warm space small to conserve heat. But I could see in her eyes that she understood we were making life and death decisions, and she accepted it with the kind of maturity that no 8-year-old should have to develop. That evening, we huddled together in the living room, listening to the wind outside and the occasional sound of cattle moving around in the yard. The radio was our only entertainment, and the news wasn't encouraging. The ash clouds were still blocking the sun across most of North America, and temperatures were continuing to drop in areas that had never experienced serious cold. I found myself thinking about the radio signal I'd picked up from the survivor. Group 200 miles south. They'd sounded organized, well-supplied, like they'd found a way to make the new reality work. But getting there would mean leaving immediately, before our remaining fuel ran out, and traveling through conditions that could kill us all. Mark was in favor of making the trip. He argued that staying here was certain death, that we had to take the chance while we still had transportation and some supplies. Lisa was more cautious, worried about traveling with Emma in such dangerous conditions. I was torn between my loyalty to the farm and my responsibility to keep these people alive. The 17th day brought the coldest temperatures yet. Minus 15 degrees when I woke up, cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. The small generator had run all night, and the living room was barely warm enough to be survivable. I could see ice crystals forming on the windows inside the house. 3 of my cattle had died during the night, frozen solid in the barnyard. The survivors were huddled together near the house, trying to share body heat. I counted 14 animals. Still alive, down from the 300 I'd started with less than 3 weeks ago. The sight of them standing in the snow, too weak to move, was almost too much to bear. I spent the morning working on the truck, making sure it would start in the extreme cold and checking the tire chains that I'd need for driving through ash and snow. The vehicle had been sitting in the garage, protected from the worst of the weather, but I knew that starting it and keeping it running would be a challenge. Lisa was packing our supplies, trying to figure out what we could carry and what we'd have to leave behind. We had enough canned food for maybe a week of travel, enough water for 3 days, and enough gasoline for the small generator to last 2 days if we used it sparingly. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. Mark was studying maps, trying to figure out the best route to reach the survivor group. The main highways would be impassable, clogged with abandoned vehicles and covered in ash. We'd have to take back roads, farm routes that I knew from years of driving around the county. It would be slower, but it might be our only chance. Emma was surprisingly calm about the prospect of leaving. She helped pack her few belongings without complaint and asked intelligent questions about how long the trip would take and what we'd do when we got there. I was impressed by her resilience, her ability to adapt to circumstances that would terrify most adults. That afternoon, I made my final rounds of the farm. I walked through the barn one last time, checking the stalls where I'd milked cows every morning for 14 years. I visited Sarah's grave in the family plot, telling her what I was planning and asking for her blessing. I stood in the kitchen, where 3 generations of Kowalski men had eaten their meals and made their plans. The hardest part was accepting that I might never see this place again. This farm was my heritage, my connection to my family's history, the only life I'd ever known. Leaving felt like betraying my grandfather's memory, and abandoning the promise I'd made to keep the family legacy alive. But I also knew that Sarah would have told me to save the people I could save, to choose life over property. She'd always been practical about what mattered most, and she would have understood that staying here meant watching everyone die for the sake of preserving something that might not survive anyway. The 18th day brought the decision point. The small generator was running on fumes, and we had maybe 12 hours of heat left. The truck started on the second try, but I could hear the engine struggling in the cold. If we were going to leave, it had to be now, while we still had fuel and the vehicle was still functioning. I loaded our supplies into the truck bed and covered them with tarps to protect them from the ash and snow. We had enough food for a week, enough water for 3 days, warm clothes, blankets, tools, and the small generator with its remaining fuel. It wasn't much to start a new life with, but it was more than many people had. Mark sat in the front passenger seat, maps spread across his lap and a determined look on his face. Lisa and Emma were in the back seat, bundled up in layers of clothing and wrapped in blankets. They looked scared but ready, understanding that this was our only chance. I took one last look at the farmhouse where I'd lived my entire adult life. The windows were already icing over on the inside, and I knew that within hours, the pipes would freeze and burst. The building that had sheltered my family for 3 generations would become uninhabitable, just another casualty of the disaster. That had changed everything. The cattle were still alive, 14 survivors out of the 300 I'd started with. I couldn't take them with us, and I couldn't bring myself to slaughter them. I opened the gate to the road and hoped that instinct would drive them south, toward warmer areas where they might have a chance to survive. I put the truck in gear and started down the driveway, leaving tracks in the ash that covered everything. In the rear-view mirror, I could see the barn getting smaller, the house disappearing behind the gray trees. I was leaving everything I'd ever known to gamble on finding strangers who might not even still be alive. The roads were worse than I'd expected. The ash had mixed with snow and ice to create a slippery, treacherous surface that made driving dangerous even at low speeds. I had to use the tire chains immediately, and even then, the truck struggled for traction on the hills. We saw abandoned vehicles everywhere. Cars stuck in ash drifts, trucks that had slid off the road, motorcycles lying on their sides where their riders had lost control. Some of the vehicles still had people in them, frozen bodies that would stay there until spring came, if it ever did. Mark was navigating using back roads and farm routes that avoided the main highways. His city-bred sense of direction wasn't perfect, but he was learning to read the landscape the way farmers do. Lisa kept Emma distracted with games and stories, trying to make the journey seem like an adventure instead of a desperate flight from death. By afternoon, we'd traveled maybe 50 miles, less than a quarter of the distance we needed to cover. The truck was using more fuel than I'd calculated, fighting the difficult road conditions and the extreme cold. I started to worry that we wouldn't have enough gas to complete the journey. We stopped at an abandoned gas station to see if we could find any fuel, but the pumps were frozen solid and the power was out. I used a hand pump to siphon gas from some of the abandoned cars, getting maybe 5 gallons of questionable fuel that might or might not keep us moving. Emma found the body of a woman in one of the cars, frozen behind the steering wheel with her hands still gripping the controls. It was the first human casualty she'd seen up close, and it shook her more than anything else had. Lisa held her while she cried, explaining as gently as possible that the woman had probably died quickly and without pain. That evening, we made camp in an abandoned farmhouse that still had some protection from the wind. I ran the small generator just long enough to warm up some canned food and melt snow for drinking water. We huddled together in sleeping bags, sharing body heat and trying to stay optimistic about our chances. The radio crackled to life around midnight, and I heard the signal from the survivor group again. They were still broadcasting, still asking for people to respond, still sounding organized and hopeful. I tried to respond with my handheld radio, but I couldn't tell if they were receiving my signal. We were still too far away. The 19th day brought mechanical problems. The truck started reluctantly, and I could hear something wrong with the engine. The extreme cold was affecting every system, from the battery to the transmission fluid. I knew we were pushing the vehicle beyond its limits, but we didn't have any choice. We made slower progress that day, maybe 30 miles through increasingly difficult terrain. The ash was deeper here, sometimes reaching the truck's bumper, and I had to stop frequently to dig us out of drifts. Mark helped with the digging, but I could see that the physical exertion was wearing him down. Lisa was doing her best to keep Emma's spirits up, but the little girl was getting tired and scared. She hadn't complained once about the cold or the discomfort, but I could see the stress in her eyes. She was being braver than any child should have to be. We passed through several small towns that looked completely abandoned. Houses with frozen pipes and collapsed roofs, stores with their windows broken and their contents scattered by looters or the wind. It was like driving through a graveyard, seeing the remnants of communities that had simply ceased to exist. I found myself thinking about the farm again, wondering if I'd made the right decision to leave. My grandfather had survived the Dust Bowl by staying put, by being stubborn and resourceful. But he'd also been alone, responsible only for himself. I had 3 other people depending on me now, and that changed the calculation completely. The truck broke down that afternoon. The engine overheated despite the cold, probably because the cooling system had been damaged by ash particles. I managed to get it running again by adding snow to the radiator, but I knew it was a temporary fix. We were maybe halfway to our destination, and our transportation was failing. Mark suggested that we try to find another vehicle, but I knew that anything we found would probably be in worse condition than our truck. We'd seen dozens of abandoned cars, but most of them had been sitting in the cold for weeks, and their batteries would be dead and their fluids frozen. That night, we camped in another abandoned building, this one a small church that still had some of its roof intact. I found myself praying for the first time since Sarah's funeral, asking for the strength to get these people to safety and the wisdom to make the right decisions. Emma asked me if I thought we were going to make it, and I told her honestly that I didn't know. But I also told her that we were going to keep trying, that giving up wasn't an option as long as we were still breathing. She nodded seriously and said she understood, showing a maturity that broke my heart. The 20th day brought the hardest test yet. The truck wouldn't start at all, no matter what I tried. The battery was dead, the engine was frozen, and we were stranded in the middle of nowhere with limited supplies and no way to call for help. I spent the morning trying everything I could think of. I built a fire under the engine to warm it up. I tried jump-starting the battery with the small generator. I checked every connection and fluid level. Nothing worked. The truck was dead, and we were on foot in conditions that could kill us in hours. Mark wanted to keep walking, to try to reach the survivor group on foot. But I knew that was impossible. We were still more than 100 miles away, and traveling on foot through deep ash and sub-zero temperatures would be suicide, especially with a child. Lisa was trying to stay calm, but I could see the panic in her eyes. She'd trusted me to get her family to safety, and now we were stranded with no plan and no hope of rescue. I felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on me, the knowledge that my decisions would determine whether these people lived or died. I made the hardest decision of my life that afternoon. I told them we were going to stay in the church, that we were going to use our remaining supplies to survive as long as possible, and that we were going to hope that help would come or conditions would improve. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than dying in the snow. We moved all our supplies inside the church and set up a survival camp around the altar. I used the small generator sparingly, just enough to keep us from freezing during the coldest parts of the night. We rationed our food carefully, stretching each meal as far as possible. Emma was the one who kept our spirits up during those dark hours. She told jokes, played games with bottle caps and string, and talked about what she wanted to do when the weather got better. Her optimism was infectious, and it reminded me why we were fighting so hard to stay alive. But I knew our situation was desperate. We had maybe 3 days of food left, 2 days of fuel for the generator, and no way to get more of either. The radio signal from the survivor group was getting weaker, which meant either they were moving away or their equipment was failing. That night, I sat in the church pew, thinking about Sarah, about my grandfather, about all the choices that had led me to this moment. I'd done everything I could to save these people, but it might not be enough. Sometimes survival comes down to luck as much as skill, and I wasn't sure we had enough of either. The 21st day would bring either rescue or the beginning of the end. But for now, we were still alive, still fighting, still hoping that somewhere out there, other people were doing the same thing we were doing. The real test was just beginning, and everything that had happened so far was just preparation for what came next. The 21st day started with Emma burning up with fever. I woke up to Lisa shaking me, her voice tight with panic as she told me her daughter was sick. When I touched Emma's forehead, her skin was hot enough to fry an egg on. In these conditions, with no medical supplies and no way to get help, a fever could kill her as surely as the cold. I'd dealt with sick animals my entire farming career, and I knew the basics of treating illness. Keep the patient hydrated, control the fever, watch for complications. But Emma wasn't a cow, and I wasn't a doctor. I was a farmer trying to play medic with a child's life hanging in the balance. We moved Emma closer to the small generators, heat source, and started giving her small sips of melted snow water. Lisa was trying to stay calm, but I could see the terror in her eyes. Mark was pacing around the church like a caged animal, asking me every few minutes if there was anything else we could do. I remembered that my grandfather used to treat fevers with willow bark tea, something about the bark containing natural aspirin. But we were in a frozen wasteland with no trees, no medicine, and no options except to hope that Emma's immune system was strong enough to fight off whatever was making her sick. The fever climbed throughout the morning. Emma was delirious, talking to people who weren't there, asking for toys she'd left behind in Milwaukee. Lisa sat beside her daughter, holding her hand and whispering reassurances that none of us believed. I could see that we were losing her, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. Mark confronted me around noon, demanding to know why I hadn't planned for medical emergencies, why we didn't have antibiotics or fever reducers. I wanted to tell him that I'd done the best I could with what we had, that I wasn't responsible for every disaster that could befall us. But arguing wouldn't help Emma, so I kept my mouth shut and focused on trying to keep her comfortable. I made a decision that went against everything I'd learned about conserving resources. I cranked up the small generator to maximum heat and used precious fuel to warm the church to a temperature that might help break Emma's fever. It was a gamble that could leave us freezing later, but watching a child die was something I couldn't live with. The extra heat seemed to help. Emma's fever peaked around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, then slowly started to drop. She was still sick, still weak, but she was responding to her parents when they talked to her. I'd never been so relieved to see a little girl ask for water. Lisa cried when Emma's fever broke, the kind of crying that comes from relief mixed with exhaustion. Mark hugged his daughter like he'd never let her go again. I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders, but I also knew we'd used almost a full day's worth of fuel in 6 hours. Our survival timeline had just gotten a lot shorter. That evening, Emma was well enough to eat a little bit of our canned soup. She was pale and tired, but the crisis had passed. I realized that taking care of these people had become more important to me than my own survival. They weren't just refugees I was helping anymore. They'd become my family, the people I was responsible for protecting. The 22nd day brought the sound I'd been hoping for since we'd arrived at the church. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but I recognized it immediately. The rumble of a diesel engine, heavy and powerful, coming from the direction of the road. I grabbed my rifle and ran to the window, not sure if I should be hopeful or terrified. In a situation like this, other people could be rescuers or threats. Desperate people do desperate things, and we had supplies that someone might be willing to kill for. What I saw was a military truck, painted in winter camouflage and equipped with snow chains and extra fuel tanks. It was moving slowly down the road, stopping at every building to check for survivors. I could see armed soldiers in the back, but they looked organized and professional, not like raiders or desperate refugees. I sent Mark to stay with Lisa and Emma while I went outside to signal the truck. I didn't want to take any chances with the family's safety, but I also knew this might be our only chance for rescue. I stepped out of the church with my hands visible, my rifle slung across my back in a non-threatening position. The truck stopped when the driver saw me, and two soldiers climbed out with their weapons ready but not aimed. They were professionals, trained to be cautious but not aggressive. The sergeant in charge introduced himself and asked how many people we had and what our condition was. I told him about our situation, about the broken-down truck and our limited supplies. He listened without interrupting, then asked to see the others. I brought him inside the church, where he quickly assessed our condition and checked Emma's health. He was competent and reassuring, the kind of person you want to see in an emergency. The sergeant explained that they were part of a federal disaster relief operation, evacuating survivors to a refugee camp about 50 miles south. The camp had heated buildings, medical facilities, food supplies, and communication equipment. It sounded like paradise compared to our current situation. But there was a catch. The truck was already loaded with other survivors they'd picked up along the route, and they only had room for 3 more people. One of us would have to stay behind or wait for the next truck, which might not come for days or weeks. Mark immediately volunteered to stay, saying that his wife and daughter needed to get to safety first. Lisa argued with him, insisting that family should stay together. Emma was too young to understand the full implications, but she could sense the tension and started crying again. I made the decision for them. I told the sergeant to take all 3 members of the family, that I would wait for the next truck, or find my own way to the camp. Mark protested, saying I'd done more to save them than anyone could ask. But I was firm in my decision. These people had a chance for a real future, and I wasn't going to be the reason they didn't get it. The sergeant tried to convince me to come with them, explaining that the next evacuation might not happen for weeks. But I'd made up my mind. I helped them load their belongings onto the truck and said goodbye to the family that had become more important to me than my own survival. Emma hugged me before she climbed into the truck, whispering that she hoped I'd find them at the camp soon. Lisa kissed my cheek and thanked me for everything, her eyes filled with tears. Mark shook my hand and promised to find a way to repay me someday, though we both knew that wasn't necessary. I watched the truck disappear down the road, carrying away the people I'd spent 2 weeks protecting. The church felt impossibly empty without them, and I realized how much their presence had meant to me. I'd found a new purpose in taking care of them, and now that purpose was gone. But I wasn't ready to give up. I still had some supplies, including enough fuel for the small generator to last maybe 2 more days. I had my rifle and my knowledge of survival, and I had the sergeant's promise that another truck would come eventually. I just had to stay alive long enough for them to find me. The 23rd day was the loneliest of my entire life. I'd been alone on the farm after Sarah died, but that was different. I'd chosen that solitude, and I'd had work to keep me busy. This was isolation forced on me by circumstances, with nothing to do but wait and hope and try not to freeze to death. I spent The morning organizing my remaining supplies and making plans for survival. I had maybe 4 days of food left, 2 days of fuel for the generator, and enough water for a week if I was careful. It wasn't much, but it was more than many people had in this new world. The radio was my only connection to the outside world, and the news wasn't encouraging. The ash clouds were still blocking the sun across most of North America, and governments were struggling to maintain basic services. Refugee camps were overcrowded, supply lines were breaking down, and millions of people were dying from cold and starvation. But there were also reports of communities that were adapting, groups of survivors who'd found ways to generate heat and grow food despite the conditions. People were learning to live in this new reality, and some of them were even thriving. It gave me hope that humanity would find a way through this disaster. I found myself talking to Sarah's picture again, telling her about the decisions I'd made and asking for her guidance. I could almost hear her voice telling me to be patient, to trust that help would come, to focus on staying alive one day at a time. She'd always been better at managing stress than I was. That afternoon, I heard vehicles on the road again. For a moment, I thought it might be another evacuation truck, but the sound was wrong. These were smaller engines, probably cars or pickup trucks, and they were moving fast. I grabbed my rifle and went to the window to investigate. What I saw was a convoy of civilian vehicles, maybe 6 or 7 cars and trucks loaded down with supplies and people. They weren't military or government, just ordinary folks who'd banded together for survival. They stopped at the church and sent a representative to talk to me. The man introduced himself as Robert, a former insurance agent who'd become the leader of their survival group. They were heading south toward warmer climates, following rumors of communities that had successfully established themselves in areas less affected by the ashfall. Robert offered to let me join their convoy, but they couldn't spare any supplies or fuel. I'd have to contribute my own resources and skills to the group effort. It was a fair offer, and probably my best chance of reaching safety, but it would mean using up my remaining fuel and food during the journey. I made the decision to stay with the church. The military had promised to send another evacuation truck, and I trusted them more than I trusted a group of desperate civilians. Robert understood my choice, but he warned me that help might not come as quickly as I hoped. Government resources were stretched thin, and rural areas were low priority. I watched their convoy disappear down the road, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But I'd committed to waiting for official rescue, and I was going to stick with that decision. Sometimes survival requires patience as much as action. The 24th day brought the coldest weather yet. The thermometer I'd brought from the truck read -20 degrees, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. The small generator was struggling to keep even one room of the church warm, and I knew my fuel wouldn't last much longer. I spent the day gathering everything combustible I could find in the church. Wooden pews, hymnals, anything that would burn to provide heat. When the generator failed, it felt wrong to destroy a house of worship, but I figured God would understand the circumstances. The radio brought news of massive evacuations from northern cities, with millions of people fleeing south toward warmer climates. The refugee camps were overwhelmed, and many people were dying during the journey. It made me grateful that Mark, Lisa, and Emma had gotten out when they did. I also heard reports of communities that were thriving despite the conditions. Groups of people who'd pooled their resources, found renewable energy sources, and established sustainable food production. It gave me hope that this disaster might not be the end of civilization, just a transition to something different. That evening, I made my first fire in the church, feeding wooden pews into the flames to stay warm. The heat felt wonderful, but I knew I was burning through my emergency reserves quickly. Each piece of wood I threw on the fire was something I wouldn't have later when I really needed it. I found myself thinking about my grandfather again, about the stories he'd told about surviving the Dust Bowl. He'd talked about making hard choices, about doing whatever it took to stay alive. I wondered what he would think of me burning down a church to keep from freezing, and I decided he'd probably understand. The 25th day brought mechanical failure again. The small generator finally gave up completely, leaving me with no source of heat except the wood fires. I'd expected this to happen eventually, but it was still a shock when the familiar rumble stopped and wouldn't start again. I spent the morning trying to repair the generator, but the problem was beyond my mechanical skills. Something had frozen inside the engine, and I didn't have the tools or parts to fix it. I was down to burning wood and hoping that would be enough to keep me alive. The wood fires were inefficient and dangerous. I had to tend them constantly to keep them burning, and the smoke was making the air inside the church barely breathable. I was also burning through my fuel supply much faster than I'd anticipated. At this rate, I had maybe 2 days of heat left. I started rationing my food more severely, eating only one small meal per day to stretch my supplies. Hunger was becoming a constant companion, but it was better than starving to death. I'd learned from my farming experience that humans can survive much longer without food than without heat. That afternoon, I heard the radio signal from the survivor group I'd been tracking since leaving the farm. They were much closer now, maybe only 30 miles away, and they were actively looking for other survivors to join their community. It was tempting to try to reach them, but I knew traveling 30 miles on foot in these conditions would probably kill me. I tried to respond to their radio calls, but my handheld unit wasn't powerful enough to reach them. I was so close to making contact with other survivors, but I might as well have been on another planet for all the good it did me. That night, I sat by my wood fire reading one of the Bibles I'd found in the church. I wasn't particularly religious, but there was something comforting about the familiar words and stories. I found myself drawn to the passages about endurance, about faith during difficult times, about the promise that suffering would eventually end. The 26th day brought a crisis that nearly broke me. I woke up to find that my wood fire had died during the night, and the inside of the church was only a few degrees warmer than the outside temperature. I was shivering uncontrollably, and I could barely feel my fingers and toes. I managed to get another fire started, but I was burning through my wood supply at an alarming rate. I calculated that I had maybe one more day of fuel left, and after that, I'd be completely dependent on whatever I could scavenge from the church structure itself. The hunger was getting worse too. I'd been rationing my food so severely that I was constantly dizzy and weak. I caught myself making simple mistakes, losing focus, forgetting basic survival procedures. Malnutrition was affecting my ability to think clearly, which made every other problem worse. I spent the afternoon breaking apart more church furniture, creating a pile of wood that might last another day if I was careful. Each piece I destroyed felt like a small betrayal, but I didn't have any choice. Staying alive was more important than preserving a building. The radio brought reports of successful evacuations from other rural areas, but there was no mention of trucks coming to my location. I was starting to realize that the military might have forgotten about me, that I might be completely on my own until I could find a way to reach other survivors. That evening, I made a decision that scared me more than anything else I'd faced. I was going to try to reach the survivor group on foot. It was probably suicide, but staying in the church was definitely suicide. At least walking gave me a chance, however small. I spent the night preparing for the journey. I packed my remaining food, filled containers with water, gathered every piece of warm clothing I had. I also wrote a note explaining who I was and what had happened in case someone found my body later. But as I sat by the fire making my final preparations, I heard something that changed everything. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the wood, but it was definitely the sound of an engine. Not the heavy rumble of a military truck this time, but something smaller and more familiar. I grabbed my rifle and went to the window, hoping against hope that rescue had finally arrived. What I saw in the distance were headlights cutting through the gray ash, moving slowly but steadily toward the church. Someone was coming, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to believe that I might actually survive this ordeal. The vehicle was getting closer, and I could hear that it was struggling with the road conditions. Whoever was driving was fighting the same ash and ice that had defeated my truck, but they were making progress. I prepared to signal them, to let them know that someone was alive in the church and needed help. Everything I'd been through, every decision I'd made, every sacrifice I'd endured, had led to this moment. The next few minutes would determine whether I lived or died, whether I'd ever see Mark, Lisa, and Emma again, whether I'd have a chance to rebuild my life in this new world that the ash had created. The headlights belonged to a modified pickup truck with snow chains and extra fuel tanks welded to the sides. As it got closer, I could see that it was painted white with red crosses on the doors, some kind of improvised medical vehicle. The driver was wearing military surplus gear, and there was someone in the passenger seat with what looked like radio equipment. I stepped outside the church with my hands visible, my rifle slung across my back in a non-threatening position. The truck stopped about 50 feet away, and the driver climbed out slowly, keeping his hands where I could see them. He introduced himself as Dr. Martinez, a former Army medic who is now working with civilian rescue groups. Dr. Martinez explained that they'd received my radio transmissions, weak and intermittent as they were, and had triangulated my position. They were part of a larger network of survivors who'd established communication links across the region, coordinating rescue efforts and sharing information about safe areas. The passenger was a woman named Janet, a former emergency dispatcher who'd become their radio operator. She'd been monitoring frequencies for weeks, picking up distress calls and coordinating with military units, civilian groups, and individual survivors. My transmissions had been among dozens they'd logged, but they'd finally been able to mount a rescue mission. They asked about my condition and my supplies, and I told them honestly that I was down to maybe 6 hours of fuel for heating and 2 days of food. Dr. Martinez checked me over quickly, noting signs of malnutrition and mild hypothermia, but declaring me fit for travel. Janet asked if there were other survivors in the area, and I told her about the military truck that had taken Mark, Lisa, and Emma. The rescue team confirmed that the family had made it safely to the refugee camp. They'd actually passed along information about my location, which was how the civilian rescue network had known to look for me. Hearing that the people I'd protected were safe lifted a weight off my shoulders that I'd been carrying for days. Dr. Martinez explained that they were taking me to a survivor community called Haven, about 40 miles southeast of my current location. It wasn't a government refugee camp, but a self-organized group of about 300 people who'd pooled their resources and skills to create a sustainable settlement. Haven was built around a decommissioned military base that had geothermal heating, solar power systems, and enough infrastructure to support a small population. The community included farmers, mechanics, medical professionals, teachers, and craftspeople who were working together to rebuild civilization on a smaller scale. I gathered my few remaining possessions and climbed into the truck, leaving behind the church that had sheltered me for 6 days. As we drove away, I took one last look at the building where I'd nearly died, where I'd burned wooden pews to stay alive, where I'd made the decision to try walking to safety rather than wait for rescue that might never come. The drive to Haven took almost 3 hours through difficult terrain. The ash had mixed with snow and ice to create road conditions that were treacherous even with chains and four-wheel drive. Dr. Martinez was an experienced driver, but we still got stuck twice and had to dig ourselves out. Janet kept up a steady stream of radio chatter with other rescue teams and the Haven base station. She was coordinating supply drops, medical evacuations, and communication relays across a network that stretched for hundreds of miles. It was impressive to see how organized the civilian survivors had become. During the drive, Dr. Martinez told me about Haven's history. It had started with about 50 people who'd been employees at the military base when the disaster struck. They had access to emergency supplies, communication equipment, and renewable energy systems that had allowed them to survive the initial crisis. As word spread about their success, other survivors had made their way to Haven, families fleeing. The cities, rural people whose farms had failed, professionals with useful skills who'd lost their homes and jobs. The community had grown organically, accepting people based on their ability to contribute and their commitment to the common good. Haven had established trade relationships with other survivor communities, exchanging surplus food for medical supplies, tools for fuel, knowledge for raw materials. They'd created a network of mutual support that was helping dozens of communities survive and even thrive in the new reality. We arrived at Haven just after sunset, though it was hard to tell day from night under the perpetual gray sky. The base was surrounded by a fence, not to keep people out but to mark the boundaries of the community and control access to their resources. Guards at the gate recognized Dr. Martinez and waved us through without question. The first thing I noticed was the lights. Haven had electric power, something I hadn't seen since leaving my farm almost 2 weeks ago. The buildings were heated, people were moving around freely, and there was a sense of normalcy that I'd forgotten was possible. Dr. Martinez took me to the medical facility, a converted barracks building that had been equipped with examination rooms, a small surgical suite, and beds for patients who needed extended care. A nurse checked my vital signs, gave me antibiotics for a respiratory infection I didn't know I had, and started me on a nutrition program to address the weight I'd lost. The doctor who examined me was a former emergency room physician named Dr. Sarah Chun. She was thorough and professional, but also kind and understanding about what I'd been through. She explained that malnutrition and exposure were common problems among new arrivals, and that most people recovered quickly with proper care. Dr. Chun asked about my background and skills, explaining that Haven operated on a contribution system, where everyone was expected to work according to their abilities. My farming experience would be valuable, since food production was one of their highest priorities. I was assigned to a dormitory room in a heated building that housed new arrivals and single residents. It wasn't much, just a bed, a locker, and a small desk, but it was warm and dry and safe. After weeks of struggling to survive, having basic shelter felt like luxury. That first night at Haven, I slept for 12 straight hours. It was the deepest, most restful sleep I'd had since leaving my farm. For the first time in weeks, I didn't have to worry about freezing to death, running out of fuel, or protecting other people. I could just rest and let someone else handle the problems. The 27th day was my first full day as a member of the Haven community. I woke up to the sound of people talking in the hallway, children playing somewhere in the building, the normal sounds of human activity that I'd almost forgotten existed. I reported to the community center for orientation, where I met with a woman named Patricia who served as Haven's coordinator. She explained how the community was organized, what the rules were, and what my responsibilities would be. It was like starting a new job, except the stakes were survival instead of just making money. Patricia showed me around the facility, explaining how they'd converted military buildings for civilian use. The mess hall served 3 meals a day to the entire community. The workshop areas had been equipped with tools for mechanical repair, electronics, woodworking, and textile production. The greenhouse complex was where they grew fresh vegetables year-round using geothermal heat. I was particularly interested in the agricultural operation. Haven had converted several large buildings into hydroponic growing facilities, using artificial light and nutrient solutions to produce food regardless of outside weather conditions. It was more sophisticated than anything I'd used on my dairy farm, but the basic principles were familiar. The community had also established livestock operations in heated barns, raising chickens for eggs and meat, goats for milk and cheese, and rabbits for protein. They'd started with animals rescued from abandoned farms, and they were slowly building up breeding populations that could sustain the community long term. I met with the agricultural supervisor, a former county extension agent named Robert, who assessed my farming knowledge and assigned me to work in the greenhouse complex. My experience with crop rotation, soil management, and livestock care made me a valuable addition to their team. That afternoon, I worked alongside other community members, learning their systems and contributing what knowledge I could. It felt good to be useful again, to be working towards something positive instead of just struggling to survive. These people had found a way to build something sustainable in the ruins of the old world. The evening meal was served in the community mess hall, where everyone gathered to eat and share news of the day. It was a social time when people caught up with friends, discussed community business, and welcomed new arrivals. I sat with Dr. Martinez and Janet, who introduced me to other community members. I learned that Haven was just one of several successful survivor communities in the region. They maintained radio contact with settlements hundreds of miles away, sharing information about weather patterns, resource availability, and technological innovations. It was the beginning of a new kind of civilization, smaller and more localized than what had come before. The 28th day brought my first real work assignment. I was placed in charge of a section of the greenhouse complex, responsible for managing the growth of leafy vegetables that formed a major part of the community's diet. It was detailed work that required attention to lighting, temperature, nutrients, and pest control. Working in the greenhouse reminded me of the satisfaction I'd felt managing my dairy farm. The pleasure of caring for living things and seeing them thrive under proper management. The technology was different, but the fundamental relationship between human skill and natural processes was the same. I also started learning about Haven's governance system. The community was run by a council of elected representatives with major decisions made by consensus among the entire adult population. It was more democratic than most places I'd lived, with every member having a voice in how the community was managed. Patricia explained that Haven's success came from combining individual expertise with collective decision-making. People contributed their specialized skills while sharing in the benefits of community resources. It was a model that seemed to work well for their size and circumstances. That evening, I attended my first community meeting, where residents discussed issues ranging from resource allocation to long-term planning. There was debate about whether to accept more refugees, how to expand food production, and what preparations to make for the coming winter. I listened more than I spoke, trying to understand the community dynamics and figure out where I might contribute beyond my agricultural work. These people had created something remarkable, and I wanted to be part of making it even better. The 29th day brought news that changed my perspective on our situation. Janet received radio reports indicating that the ash clouds were beginning to thin in some areas, allowing more sunlight to reach the ground. Temperatures were still well below normal, but the trend suggested that the worst of the crisis might be passing. The news was cautiously optimistic. It would take years for the climate to return to normal, if it ever did. Agricultural production would remain difficult, and many regions would stay uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. But the immediate threat of human extinction was diminishing. Haven's leadership used this information to adjust their long-term planning. Instead of just focusing on survival, they could begin thinking about growth and expansion. There was talk of establishing satellite communities, setting up trade networks, and sending exploration teams to assess conditions in other areas. I found myself thinking about my old farm, wondering what condition it was in and whether it would ever be viable again. The livestock were certainly dead by now, and the buildings had probably suffered damage from freezing and lack of maintenance. But the land itself would still be there, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Dr. Martinez asked if I'd be interested in joining an exploration team that would assess agricultural potential in areas that had been abandoned. My farming knowledge and survival experience would be valuable for determining whether former agricultural regions could be reclaimed. The idea appealed to me. I'd found a home at Haven, but I also felt drawn to the challenge of rebuilding what had been lost. My grandfather had stayed on his land during the Dust Bowl, and maybe it was time for me to go back and reclaim my family's legacy. That evening, I called Patricia to discuss the possibility of leading an agricultural assessment mission back to my home region. She was interested in the idea, especially since Haven needed to identify new sources of food production to support their growing population. The 30th day marked exactly 1 month since the Yellowstone eruption had changed everything. I spent the morning working in the greenhouse, tending plants that represented hope for the future. These vegetables would feed people, help them stay healthy, give them strength to rebuild their lives. After lunch, I attended a planning meeting for the agricultural assessment mission. Patricia had approved the project, and Dr. Martinez would lead a team of 6 people to survey farming regions. Within a 100-mile radius of Haven, I would serve as the agricultural specialist, helping determine which areas had the best potential for food production. The mission would take about 2 weeks, traveling in a modified truck equipped with communication gear, medical supplies, and everything needed for extended field work. We'd visit abandoned farms, assess soil conditions, check infrastructure, and interview any survivors we encountered. I was excited about the prospect of seeing my old farm again, of walking through fields that my grandfather had planted and my father had harvested. But I was also nervous about what we might find, about how much damage had been done by a month of neglect and extreme weather. That afternoon, I packed my few possessions and prepared for the mission. I'd grown attached to Haven, to the sense of community and security it provided. But I also knew that rebuilding civilization would require people willing to venture beyond safe boundaries and take risks for the greater good. Janet helped me test the radio equipment I'd be carrying, showing me the frequencies and procedures for maintaining contact with Haven. The communication network was vital for coordinating rescue efforts, sharing information, and ensuring that exploration teams didn't simply disappear into the wasteland. As the day ended, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. I'd started as an isolated farmer trying to save his livestock. I'd become responsible for protecting a family of strangers. I'd learned to make impossible choices and live with the consequences. I discovered that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about maintaining hope for the future. Tomorrow, I would begin the next phase of my journey, heading back toward the farm where this all began. I didn't know what I'd find there, whether the land could be reclaimed or whether it was lost forever. But I knew that someone had to try. Someone had to take the first steps toward rebuilding what we'd lost. My grandfather had survived the Dust Bowl by being stubborn and resourceful, by refusing to give up when everything seemed hopeless. My father had built on that foundation, creating something larger and more prosperous. Sarah had taught me the importance of planning for the worst while hoping for the best. Now it was my turn to carry the family legacy forward, to take what I'd learned about survival and use it to help others rebuild their lives. The old world was gone, but the new world was still being written. And I intended to have a hand in writing it. The 30 days since the eruption had taught me that humans are remarkably adaptable, that we can survive disasters that seem impossible to overcome. Communities like Haven proved that cooperation and shared purpose could create something better than what had existed before. And people like Mark, Lisa, and Emma showed that families could endure anything as long as they had hope in each other. The Ice Age was far from over. The challenges ahead would test everything we'd learned about survival and cooperation. But we'd made it through the first month, and that gave me confidence that we could make it through whatever came next. The worst was behind us, and the work of rebuilding had begun.